I sent a cruel message to my wife. She was far away, traveling with her lover, and she didn't even imagine that I knew. While they hid, thinking they were deceiving me, here I watched everything fall apart. Every detail of the betrayal, every lie disguised as affection, everything lined up in my mind like a bomb ready to explode. She thought she had control, that I was naive, that her banal excuses about traveling for work were enough to mask her escapades with that man. The different perfume, the more carefully chosen clothes, the silences during dinner. I noticed everything. I wanted to trust, I wanted to believe that it was just a phase, that we were only distant due to circumstances, but the truth was right in front of my eyes. And it was a text message, forgotten on her cell phone, that confirmed what I feared. She was with me, but her heart and her body belonged to someone else. I remained silent for a while, trying to understand how we got here. Did I make a mistake at some point? Did I stop being the man she needed? So many sleepless nights, so many attempts to understand the signs that I ignored. Until I couldn't anymore. My heart was in pieces, and the only thing I could think about was how she had destroyed what we had, what we were. The man she chose. Did he know she was married? Did he know what was at stake? At that moment, while she was with him, I felt the urge to end it once and for all. I picked up my cell phone and typed the most cutting message I could imagine. I know everything. There were no more lies that could save her, no more excuses that could erase what she had done. With a simple tap, I sent it. And I waited. The silence that came after was suffocating. Imagine her face when she read that message. She should have been in bed with him at that exact moment. Did you look at your cell phone and your heart stopped? Or did she pretend to him that everything was fine, while she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet? What did she think, what did she feel? Fear? Blame? Anger? I didn't know it, but my anger was growing by the second. There was no going back. She had crossed the line and now the world as she knew it was about to fall apart. How could I look at her the same way after all? How could she face me, knowing that her body already belonged to someone else? I picked up the cell phone again. I couldn't hold back. Where are you? I knew exactly where she was, but I wanted to hear her lie one more time. I wanted to see how far she would take the lie. And then, the answer came. I'm at the conference. I'm going to bed early today. The audacity. The confidence in her words, as if I were a fool, as if I were in complete darkness. I couldn't help but smile. It was a bitter smile, of someone who no longer had anything to lose. I typed quickly, conference. At the hotel where you and he are staying. The silence. Time froze. I knew that on the other side, she was desperate. The truth had been exposed, naked and raw. I could imagine her, with the cell phone in her shaking hands, trying to understand how I knew, trying to find a way out, an excuse, anything that could minimize the damage. But there was no escape. She didn't respond. And I stood there, looking at my phone, waiting for something to happen. Maybe I wanted to hear a confession, maybe I wanted her to beg for forgiveness. But none of that came. Just silence. A silence that screamed everything she didn't have the courage to say. I could have left her to suffer there, alone, with her lover, but something in me needed more. I wanted to see her. I wanted to look into her eyes and feel the weight of betrayal fall on both of us. I bought a ticket to the place where they were. Time at the airport seemed to slow down, but my mind was racing. What if, when they got there, they were still together? Would she have the courage to face me? On the way, I imagined what this meeting would be like. Maybe she would cry, get on her knees, ask for forgiveness. Or maybe she lied, until her last breath, defending her mistake with the false excuse that it was just once, or that it didn't mean anything. But what disturbed me most was the uncertainty of what I would do. Part of me wanted to forgive, wanted to believe there was still something to save. The other part just wanted to destroy her, just like she destroyed our marriage. When the plane landed, my head was filled with scenarios and possibilities. Every step towards the hotel felt heavy, as if the ground was about to collapse beneath my feet. I picked up the phone and, without waiting any longer, I called her. Once, twice, 3 times. No response. But something was wrong. When I arrived at the hotel, I heard something I didn't expect. His name. An accident. The lover who stole her from me was involved in an accident, and suddenly, everything changed. What was a revenge plan was now something bigger, darker. I didn't know how to react. She was alone, scared, and the man she cheated on me with was on the verge of death. How did it all end up here? How did fate become so cruel, so sudden? The betrayal, which before burned inside me, was now swallowed by an emptiness. What would I do now? Her silence on the phone, the tears that, I knew, were already beginning to fall on the other side, were no longer because of the betrayal. She had lost more than I could ever take from her. Robert looked out the office window, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as if searching for something that was beyond his sight. The rhythm of his life seemed to follow the rhythm of that busy city, but, inside him, everything was on hold. The feeling that something was wrong, but invisible, was slowly eating away at him. Around him, the walls of the office decorated with trophies and souvenirs of his professional achievements no longer brought him the satisfaction they used to. He was a successful man, manager of a large company, with a good marriage and a comfortable home. In the eyes of those who observed him from the outside, he had everything, but inside, the emptiness seemed to grow every day. Claire, his wife, had always been a constant and welcoming presence in his life. From the moment they met, still in college, they had built a solid story, made of complicity, passion and respect. Claire was sweet, charismatic, and her presence had an almost magical way of lighting up any room. It was this glow that made her so loved by her friends and admired by those who knew her closely. Robert was proud of her and the life they had built together. There was a balance between his professionalism and her more creative and lighter side, who worked as an art curator. Their marriage was seen by many as an example of partnership and trust. However, over the past few months, Robert has started to notice subtle changes in Claire. She seemed more distracted, more absent, as if something inside her was changing without him knowing why. She had always been dedicated to her work, but her work trips were becoming more frequent and longer. Initially, he had accepted it as part of his professional routine, understanding that exhibitions and international events were an essential part of his career. But recently, these trips had become so constant that he barely saw her during the weeks. Claire had always been an independent woman, and Robert loved that trait about her. But now, there was something different. She seemed more reserved, more distant, and although he tried to convince her that they should spend more time together, there was always some commitment, some event that required her attention. He wanted to believe that it was just the demands of the job, that maybe she was going through some pressure. But behind this thought, a persistent discomfort was growing. Something he couldn't name, but it was there, present in every small gesture, in every smile that seemed a little more forced than normal. The nights Claire was away became long and lonely for Robert. He found himself adrift in his own home, surrounded by memories of happy times that seemed so far away now. He sat on the couch, watching TV, but his mind wandered, reliving the days when her laughter echoed through the room, the long conversations about her projects and dreams. The warmth of his presence seemed to have slowly dissipated, and Robert couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, he was missing something. But what? He still wasn't sure. One night, Claire arrived home later than expected. She wore an elegant dress, something she usually reserved for special events. Her perfume was stronger, a sweet and enveloping smell that filled the room. Robert, sitting in the living room armchair, watched her enter the door with a practiced smile on his face. "How was the event?" he asked casually, trying to hide the curiosity that was starting to overwhelm him. She sighed, taking off her shoes with some relief. "Exhausting. These dinners always end up being the same. But it was okay. I have another early meeting tomorrow, so I'm going to bed now. Robert nodded, but something about the way she said it bothered him. There was a lightness in her voice, a lack of detail in her explanations that didn't fit with Claire's usual style, who tended to get excited when talking about the works of art she discovered or the artists she worked with. But he chose not to press. Not at that moment. The following days followed a similar pattern. Claire left early and returned late, always with an excuse about work. She was distant, both physically and emotionally. There was a chasm forming between them, a silent, painful space that Robert didn't know how to bridge. The intimacy they once shared seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a cold, mechanical routine. He tried to get closer, suggested trips for deeper conversations, but he always came up against the invisible barrier that she had built around herself. She was there, but at the same time so far away that it was impossible to reach her. Her phone vibrated more frequently, and when he asked who it was, she responded vaguely, saying it was from work. Deep down, Robert was beginning to question himself. Had he done something wrong? Was he not giving her the attention she needed? He spent long hours at work, often immersed in meetings and deadlines, and wondered if, somehow, this had created a gap between them. But try as I might, I couldn't find a clear answer. As the emotional distance between them increased, the house, once full of life, seemed to reflect Robert's internal state. The rooms were silent, meals were quick and without meaningful conversations, and even leisurely evenings had become moments of solitude. He missed Claire, he missed the woman he had married. But the person who was there now seemed to be a stranger, someone he could no longer connect with. Robert began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Claire's cell phone was always with her, more so than usual. She rarely left it visible, and when she did, it was always with the screen facing down. He didn't want to be that kind of husband, he didn't want to doubt her. But suspicion had already planted its seed in his mind, growing with each gesture, with each evasive answer he received. One morning, while Claire was in the shower, her cell phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message. Robert hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. It wasn't in his nature to invade her privacy, but something compelled him to pick up the device. He unlocked the screen, and what he saw made him freeze. There, on the screen, a short, simple message, but one that carried immense weight: "I can't wait to see you again." Shock ran through his body. His mind tried to process what that meant. There was no name, just an unknown number. But he knew. Deep down, he knew what that meant. When Claire got out of the shower, he was already sitting on the bed, his cell phone in his hands, his gaze lost somewhere in the distance. She noticed the phone in his hands and for a brief moment her eyes widened, but soon she regained her composure. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice so calm it almost made him doubt what he had just seen. He didn't respond. Not at that moment. He just left his cell phone on the bed and left the room, his heart heavy with a certainty that he still didn't want to face. From that moment on, everything between them changed. Robert spent the night awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of his room as the hours slowly dragged by. The silence around him was deafening. Next to him, Claire slept soundly, oblivious to the whirlwind of thoughts that consumed him. What he had seen on her cell phone echoed in his mind, over and over, like a tape that didn't stop. The short and direct message had been enough to make his suspicions explode into certainty, and now he could no longer ignore the truth that surrounded him. He tried to concentrate, look for a rational solution, but his mind betrayed him, feeding on images he tried to avoid: Claire with another man, exchanging laughs and secrets, sharing moments that once belonged only to him. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was in shambles. And, in the midst of that internal chaos, Robert wondered when exactly things had started to fall apart. How had he not noticed before? Dawn arrived without relief. He got up from the bed, exhausted, and went straight to the kitchen. Claire was still sleeping, and for a moment he thought about waking her, confronting her once and for all. But there was something that held him back, an instinct that made him wait. He knew the betrayal existed now, but he didn't just want assumptions, he wanted answers. He needed to see it with his own eyes. At work, he could barely concentrate. His mind was miles away, planning what he would do next. Claire had mentioned the night before that she would be traveling again for another conference later in the week. Another business trip that, before, Robert would have accepted without question, but now sounded like an empty pretext. He knew this would be his chance. And this time, he wouldn't sit on the sidelines, waiting for answers that might never come. On the morning of the trip, Claire seemed especially cheerful, a sparkle in her eyes that Robert hadn't seen in a while. She dressed more carefully, chose a perfume he knew she reserved for special occasions. She tried to say goodbye briefly, as if she wanted to avoid long conversations, but Robert, this time, observed every detail with a controlled coldness. The smile she gave him as she said goodbye seemed filled with something he couldn't name, guilt, perhaps. Or the certainty that he was still blind. "I'll see you when I get back," she said, with a quick kiss, already moving away towards the door. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. But inside, the tension was eating away at him. As soon as Claire left, Robert took out his cell phone and began to act. He knew this was his last chance to find out the truth. Claire's phone was no longer within reach, but he had other ways to follow her. He knew the routes she usually took, the flights she usually booked. It wasn't difficult to find the hotel she was staying in, not with the resources he had. And, at the end of the day, he already knew everything he needed. This time, it wouldn't be like before. He would no longer wait for the crumbs of attention or the empty excuses of work meetings. Robert bought a plane ticket to the same city Claire would be in, determined to see her with his own eyes. Part of him still wanted to believe he was wrong, that maybe there was an explanation. But deep down, he knew. "I knew what I would find." When he arrived at the hotel, his palms were sweaty, and his stomach was churning with a mixture of nervousness and suppressed anger. He walked slowly through the lobby, feeling the weight of each step. In his mind, 1,000 scenarios played out, all leading to the same outcome, betrayal. He tried to stay calm, take deep breaths and not let the emotion overwhelm him. "I knew I needed to be meticulous, I needed to be sure." The hotel reception was elegant and understated, a perfect reflection of the kind of place Claire would choose for a date. He knew he couldn't go straight to her room without attracting attention, so he positioned himself in the lobby, watching. The clock ticked down like a relentless hammer, and every minute that passed seemed to increase his anguish. He wondered if he had the strength to continue, to see what he was about to discover. And then, he saw her. Claire got off the elevator, her hair loose and well-groomed, wearing a light and sophisticated dress that he didn't recognize. Beside her, a man. Tall, elegant, with an air of confidence that made Robert's blood boil instantly. They laughed together, as if they were in a world apart, oblivious to the watchful gaze that watched them from a distance. Every laugh, every affectionate gesture between the two was like a stab in Robert's chest. Here was the confirmation he feared so much. Claire was no longer his. She had given herself to another man, and there, before her eyes, was the proof of everything. The betrayal he had felt in every fiber of his body was now palpable, undeniable. For a moment, he felt unable to act. He stood there, standing still, watching the two walk away from the hotel, hugging each other, without noticing his presence. What should I do now? The initial impulse to confront her was suffocated by a wave of despair. What would he say? What could change with words at that moment? As he watched them disappear through the door, Robert felt a mixture of anger, pain and resignation. He knew he couldn't just leave things as they were, but he also knew he needed time. Time to think, to understand what I would do next. Because the betrayal had been revealed, yes, but what came after would be even more devastating. He just didn't know how deep the abyss before him would become. With a heavy heart and a mind filled with conflicting thoughts, Robert walked away from the hotel, the image of Claire and her lover engraved in his memory. The silence in the room was unbearable. Robert stared at the cell phone screen, his fingers still without the courage to send the last message. The weight of the discovery seemed to crush him, and everything around him seemed to go blurry, as if the world around him no longer made sense. He knew what he had seen, he knew what he had witnessed with his own eyes. Claire was no longer the same woman he had married. Something had broken, something that could never be repaired. But still, a part of him resisted accepting the truth. As he fought the urge to explode, to confront her once and for all, his cell phone screen lit up with a new notification. It was a message from Claire. "I am feeling homesick. I can't wait to go home." The irony of that sentence hit him like a punch in the stomach. He knew exactly where she was and who she was with at that moment. The image of her with her lover in the hotel was still vivid in his mind, fresh as an open wound. Robert stood up abruptly from his chair, feeling the heat of anger rising through his body. He could no longer run away. I could no longer delay the inevitable. Taking a deep breath, he decided that the time for confrontation had come. But this time, it wouldn't be through messages. He needed to see her, feel her reaction to discovering everything had been exposed. With steady steps, Robert walked to the car and drove aimlessly, his mind buzzing with thoughts. The day was bright, but within it was a darkness that seemed to consume everything. He tried to imagine what the conversation would be like, what Claire would say when confronted. Would she cry? Would you beg for forgiveness? Or would he try to lie until the last second, making up excuses he knew he could no longer accept? As he approached the hotel where he knew she was staying, Robert's heart skipped a beat. He parked the car on a side street, away from the main entrance. The plan was simple, he would wait for her to leave and confront them both. He needed to look Claire in the eye when she was unable to hide behind her lies. Time passed slowly as he waited, the tension growing by the minute. The hours seemed to drag by, and Robert felt every second like an eternity. Finally, he saw Claire leave through the side door of the hotel. She was alone, her face pale, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses. There was no sign of his lover, and for a brief moment, Robert felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. He got out of the car, approaching her with silent steps. When Claire saw him, her eyes widened, and for a second, she seemed to freeze in place. The shock on his face was undeniable. She didn't expect to see him there. "Robert," her voice trailed off, almost like a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The anger he had held in until that moment finally exploded. "I could ask you the same thing, Claire. What are you doing here?" The words came out sharp, filled with a resentment that he had tried to control, but now could no longer hold back. She slowly took off her sunglasses, revealing eyes full of fear and surprise. I can explain." "Explain what?" Robert took a step forward, his voice rising. "Explain why you're leaving a hotel you were never supposed to be in. Explain who is the man you are spending time with. Tell me, Claire, what exactly do you think you can explain?" Claire began to fidget nervously, her hands shaking as she tried to form some response. She knew there was no escape. "Robert, please, it's not what it seems. Isn't that what it looks like?" He gave a bitter, incredulous laugh. "So tell me, what is this? Because what I saw was very clear. Do you have any miraculous excuse for this scenario?" She took a step back, almost out of breath, the pressure of being cornered starting to get to her. "I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't want you to find out like that." Robert shook his head, feeling his anger growing by the second. "So what did you want, Claire? Did you want to keep lying to me? Did you want to continue pretending that our marriage still exists while you run into the arms of another man?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, but Robert felt no compassion. Not this time. She had betrayed everything they had built together, she had shattered what was left of the trust between them. "I lost myself, Robert," she finally confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Things changed between us, I felt alone, disconnected. And he was there." The words fell heavy in the air. Him. There was no longer any way to escape. The betrayal was exposed, naked and raw, and Claire knew she could no longer hide it. Robert watched her, feeling the weight of it all fall on his shoulders. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief at finally having the truth told. "What did you expect me to do?" Robert asked, voice lower now, almost a whisper. "For me to just accept it. For me to pretend nothing happened." Claire sobbed, unable to respond. She knew there was no going back. What she had done could not be undone, and now all that was left were the consequences of her actions. "I loved you, Claire. I would have done anything for us, for our life together." His voice cracked, betraying the pain he was trying to hide. "And you destroyed everything." She tried to get closer, but Robert took a step back, raising his hand as if to prevent any contact. "No. I don't want to hear anything else. There is nothing more to be said." The silence between them was suffocating. Claire continued to stand there, motionless, while Robert tried to process everything that had happened. The betrayal was exposed, but he knew there was something more. Something she hadn't said yet. He could feel it. I just need time," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Time?" Robert repeated in disbelief. "What do you think time will fix? Do you think this can be forgiven?" She shook her head, through her tears. "I don't know. I don't know what to do now." Robert looked at her for a long moment, feeling a mixture of anger, sadness, and perhaps a hint of pity. "I don't know either, Claire. But I know this, we are over." He turned slowly, leaving her behind, the image of her, broken and regretful, seared into his memory. The weight of betrayal was unbearable, but something inside Robert still warned him that the worst was yet to come. He just didn't know how deep the chasm would be. Robert walked towards the car, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last, as if his legs were made of lead. The encounter with Claire had left a deep scar, and he knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. But at the same time, there was something incomplete, something that still disturbed him. It was her silence, the way she hadn't told everything, as if there were still more secrets hidden beneath that betrayal. He got into the car and remained there for a few minutes, breathing heavily. Claire's face, desolate and soaked with tears, replayed in his mind. He wanted to hate her, he wanted to tear apart every memory they had built together, but, no matter how hard he tried, the pain of losing the love they had once shared suffocated him. He had fought so hard to keep the marriage, to preserve what they had, and now, it all seemed like a cruel lie. As he tried to calm his mind, Robert's cell phone rang. He hesitated, Claire's name flashing on the screen. For a moment, he thought about not answering, but something inside him compelled him to listen to what she had to say. He pressed the button to accept the call, without saying a word, waiting for her to speak first. "Robert," her voice was hoarse, filled with despair. "Please listen to me. I know I hurt you, but I need to tell you something I should have told you before." He gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling the tension course through his body. "What else could you tell me, Claire? Isn't what you've already done enough?" "No, it's not just about that," she replied, her voice wavering. "I didn't want to tell you like that. I didn't want to hurt you any more than I already have. But I don't know how to do that." Robert remained silent, feeling his heart racing again. He knew something was coming, but this time, there was a different anguish in Claire's words. Something deeper, darker. "Speak quickly, Claire," he finally said, his voice low but firm. "Get it over with." She took a deep breath on the other end of the line. the man you saw me with, he was in an accident. Robert felt a pang of surprise mixed with confusion. What are you talking about? After you left. He left nervous, tried to get away from me, and ended up getting into a car accident. I don't know what to do, Robert. He is in critical condition. The silence that followed was brutal. Robert processed the words, trying to understand what they meant. Claire's lover, the man who had destroyed her marriage, was now on the brink of death. Fate, cruelly, had intervened in a way he could never have predicted. And why does this interest me? Robert finally spoke, his voice cold and devoid of compassion. Does this change anything, Claire? He's dying, and you still betrayed me. None of this erases what you did. I know, she sobbed, and Robert could hear the desperation in her voice. I know it doesn't change what I did. I know I hurt you in ways I may never be able to fix. But now, everything feels so, out of control. He could die, Robert. And I don't know what that means for me. Robert shook his head in disbelief. For you? Claire, are you worried about what this means for you? The man you cheated on me with is about to die, and you think I should feel sorry for you? No, that's not it. She begged. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just saying I don't know what to do right now. I got lost, Robert. I completely lost myself, and now I'm stuck in it all, with no way out. For a moment, Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. She was trapped. But what about him? Wasn't he also trapped, in a cycle of pain, anger, and betrayal? What Claire had done couldn't be undone, but David's situation had created an additional layer of chaos that he didn't know how to process. You're right, Claire, he said finally, his voice cold as ice. You are trapped. And you know what's worse? You did this to yourself. I gave you everything, every part of me, and you destroyed it. Now, you need to deal with the consequences. She sobbed on the other end of the line, unable to respond. Robert knew he had reached a breaking point. The pain in her voice made it clear, but he no longer felt the desire to comfort her. It was empty. I'll leave you alone, Claire said, her voice almost trailing off. I just wanted you to know what was going on. You have the right to know. Robert remained silent, staring at the steering wheel, not knowing how to respond. He felt a whirlwind of emotions inside him, but none of them led him to a solution. Finally, he just said, "Goodbye, Claire." He hung up the phone, letting the weight of the situation wash over him. The betrayal had been a stab in the chest, but what came now was a different pain. It wasn't just about what Claire had done, it was about what it all meant for the future. He knew he couldn't continue living like this, trapped in a cycle of resentment. Fate had taken an unexpected turn, and Robert no longer knew what to expect. David was on the brink of death, Claire was in ruins, and he, more than ever, felt lost in the mess his life had become. With his head bowed, he took one last deep breath, trying to find clarity. But all he felt was emptiness. The sound of the phone falling onto the table echoed through the silent room. Robert remained still, his hand still pressed against the steering wheel, as if his mind was trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The echo of Claire's words still reverberated in his head, mixing with a feeling of emptiness that he couldn't understand. The betrayal, the confession, David's accident. Everything seemed confusing and distant, as if he was watching his own life unfold from afar, without being able to interfere. He got out of the car slowly, his steps heavy on the asphalt. The cold of the early evening made him shrug his shoulders, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil that was forming inside him. A part of him was still trying to process the fact that, at that very moment, the man Claire had cheated on him with was fighting for his life. The irony of it hit him in ways he didn't know how to explain. The hatred he felt for David, before so clear and burning, was now mixed with a strange feeling of indifference, as if life itself was taking charge of the betrayal. But why didn't he feel relieved? Robert walked aimlessly, lost in his thoughts, trying to understand what his next move should be. He had imagined so many times what it would be like to confront Claire, what it would be like to expose the betrayal and, perhaps, even find a way to move on. But now, the chaos that followed the confrontation seemed to have created a much deeper dilemma than he could have anticipated. David was on the verge of death. Claire, racked with guilt and fear, was sinking into a pit of regret from which she may never emerge. And he, Robert, found himself trapped in a web of conflicting feelings. Did he still love Claire? Did he want to save her? Or did you simply want to get away from it all and let the consequences take their natural course? In the distance, he saw a small diner, its lights shining in the darkness of the night. His nervous stomach made him realize he hadn't eaten in hours. He entered the place, feeling the sudden heat that contrasted with the cold outside. The simple, peaceful environment felt like a momentary refuge in the midst of the storm her life had become. Sitting in a corner, Robert ordered a coffee and stood there, observing the few people who still occupied the tables. There was something comforting in the normality of that scene, in the banal routine of strangers who went about their lives without knowing the turmoil he was facing. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to live without this pain. What it would be like to go back to a time when everything was simple, when your marriage was a place of safety and love, not a minefield of lies and betrayal. The coffee arrived, hot and bitter, but he barely noticed the taste. His thoughts were far away, turning over memories that now seemed distant and unreal. He remembered the wedding day, the smiles, the promises. He remembered the trips, the small discussions that always ended in laughter and reconciliation. And, more than anything, he remembered the look in Claire's eyes, the look that he was once sure meant unconditional love. But now, that look was tainted. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see past the betrayal. The moral dilemma began to form in his mind. He knew that as much as Claire had messed up, David's accident had shaken her deeply. She was broken, racked with guilt, not just over the betrayal, but over the fact that someone else's life hung in the balance. Could he just abandon her in that state? Let her sink alone in a sea of regret and despair? Or would he be able to forgive her, to help her through this, even if it meant letting go of his own pain? Robert had no answers. And for the first time, he realized that the future he imagined, a future where he could walk away from Claire and rebuild his life on his own, wasn't as simple as he had thought. He was stuck at a moral crossroads where none of the choices seemed fair or right. As he absently stirred his coffee, Robert's cell phone vibrated on the table. It was a message. Reluctantly, he picked up the device and saw that it was from an unknown number. The content of the message was brief, but loaded with urgency. David won't resist. She needs you. He read those words over and over, feeling the impact of each one. She needs you. As much as he tried to walk away, as much as he wanted to ignore what was happening, he knew there was a bond between him and Claire that couldn't simply be severed. The betrayal hadn't completely destroyed what they had. There was something deeper, something he couldn't define. With a heavy heart, Robert paid the bill and left the diner, feeling the cold night air invade his lungs. The mind was buzzing with questions. Should he go to her? Could he forgive Claire for what she had done, or was that impossible? As he walked back to his car, the decision slowly formed within him. He didn't know what their future would be. I didn't know if I could forgive her or if one day they would be able to rebuild what they had lost. But he knew one thing: Claire was alone at that moment, dealing with the weight of her actions and the imminent death of a man. And as much as the betrayal had broken something between them, he couldn't just let her face it alone. With shaking hands, he started the car and drove to the hospital where David was admitted. The night seemed darker now, each kilometer bringing with it a growing sense of uncertainty. He didn't know what he would find when he arrived, nor how Claire would react to his presence. But deep down, something pushed him to continue. Maybe it was the last vestige of love that remained, or maybe it was just the need to put an end to that story, once and for all. When he finally arrived at the hospital, Robert felt his heart sink. The building, lit by cold lights, looked scarier than it should have been. He got out of the car, each step towards the entrance carrying the weight of everything he had faced so far. Upon entering the hospital, he knew he was about to face the biggest dilemma of his life. The hospital felt even colder inside. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the strong white light of the corridors created an impersonal, almost inhospitable environment. Robert walked slowly, feeling each heartbeat echo in his mind. The uncertainty of what was to come weighed heavily on his shoulders, but there was something inevitable about that moment. It was no longer a question of choosing a path, he was already too involved. He followed the directions to the room where Claire was. As he approached, he saw her sitting in a chair, with her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking silently. She was devastated. There was something about her posture that made him hesitate for a brief moment. For a second, he wondered if, deep down, there was still something that could be saved between them. Claire looked up when she heard his footsteps, her eyes swollen from crying. She seemed to have aged years in a few hours. There was something broken about her that Robert had never seen before. The pride, the confidence, everything that once defined Claire's strong and confident personality, was now nothing more than a shadow of what she had been. Robert, his voice was weak, almost a whisper. I didn't know you were coming. He stood at the door, not knowing exactly what to say. There was so much unsaid between them, so many words that were lost between what they were and what they had become. He didn't know if he still had the strength to confront her again. I don't know why I came, he admitted, his voice low and restrained. But I'm here. Claire looked at him with a mixture of pain and relief. There was something in her eyes that begged for compassion, for some crumb of empathy that would lift her out of the despair she was sinking into. But Robert didn't know if he could offer that. He had been destroyed, betrayed, and the scars were still too fresh. He won't survive, Claire said, taking a deep breath, trying to control her crying. The doctors said it's a matter of hours. Robert remained silent, absorbing the news. David, the man who had destroyed his marriage, was dying. Part of him thought he should feel some satisfaction from this, but he didn't. There was no revenge, there was no relief. Just a bitter feeling that, in the end, no one would come out of that story unscathed. And you? Robert asked, his voice cold. What will happen to you now, Claire? She shook her head, unable to respond immediately. I don't know. I got lost, Robert. And now everything is falling apart. I hurt you, I destroyed our marriage, and now David. He's going to die because of me. Robert looked at her, feeling the weight of the words. He had spent days and nights imagining what it would be like to confront Claire, what it would be like to finally see her broken by guilt. And now, here she was, exactly as he imagined. But contrary to what he thought, there was no satisfaction in seeing her like this. Just emptier. It's not just because of you, he said finally. He made choices too. You both did. Claire stood up slowly, crossing the small space between them. For the first time since it all started, she tried to get closer, her eyes pleading. I know I can't change what I did, Robert. I know this cannot be erased. But please. I just wanted you to know that I regret it. Every day. He felt the tension in the air, the weight of what was to come. She was expecting something from him, maybe forgiveness, maybe a last gesture of compassion. But he didn't know if he could give her that. Not yet. I believe you regret it, he said, voice heavy with weariness. But regret doesn't fix anything. It doesn't erase what happened. She bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears, and looked at the floor. I know. I just wish things were different. Robert sighed, feeling the weight of the approaching decision. He knew that no matter how much he wanted, nothing would ever be the same. And at the same time, he felt that remaining there, trapped by her, would only sink him even further. I'm leaving, he said, bluntly. Claire looked at him, scared. What? I'm leaving, he repeated, voice firm. I can't stay here any longer. I can't be with you anymore, Claire. She took a step back, eyes wide in shock. But, what about us? And everything we went through? We no longer exist, he replied, the cold words cutting the air between them. What we had, you destroyed. I'm not perfect, I know that. But what you did cannot be fixed. I need to move on. And you too. Claire stood there in shock as he turned to leave. Tears were streaming down her face, but Robert didn't look back. For the first time in months, he felt like he was in control of his life. And at that moment, he knew that the best thing he could do was walk away. As he left the hospital, the weight of the decision began to lift, giving way to a strange feeling of freedom. He had finally made the choice he had been avoiding for so long. Claire had made irreparable mistakes, and he knew he couldn't save something that was already broken. And although the pain was still there, it was beginning to transform into something different. Something he could eventually overcome. Claire's fate would be sealed that night. She would watch David die, alone, trapped in her regret, unable to repair the damage she caused. And Robert knew that she would have to carry this weight for the rest of her life. He got into his car and drove down the empty road, his mind finally at peace. There were no more uncertainties. There was nothing to fear anymore. The future was still uncertain, but he knew that, for the first time, he was ready to face it, alone. Now, leave in the comments what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important, and we want to know how this story impacted you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, our channel does not support or encourage any form of cheating. We believe in respect and honesty in all relationships. Thanks for listening to the end.